Who has not heard of Rio's famous carnival, when for 4 days the city stops work and makes merry? Each year's display is the result of 12 months planning and rehearsal. Might suppose that Rio thinks only of fun and games. This is completely untrue, for the Cariocas are a very industrious people, as are all their countrymen. Fifth largest country in the world, enormous areas of Brazil are covered with tropical rainforests, providing much of the oxygen the rest of the world breathes. Even in the cities, there is still a hint of the jungle, and the street markets are full of brilliant tropical produce in color, reflecting the most successfully integrated society in the world. Brazil has had over 150 years of independence from its former Portuguese colonial status. It has emerged with the best of European culture, of which these remnants of the past are but graceful reminders. Today, Brazil is firmly in the modern world. Since the early 1960s, it has made enormous economic strides and claims the fastest growth rate in the world. The vast road systems spanning the country are an integral part of this expansion. One of the most significant is the Great Coastal Highway, linking all the major towns and cities on the eastern seaboard. It stretches some 4,000 kilometers, almost as far as from London to New York. At Rio, Guanabara Bay, dividing that city from its neighbor Niteroi, used to present a 9-kilometer gap in the highway. Frequent ferry services spanned this gap, saving a long and arduous drive around the bay. But the ferry could never reduce the queues, which seemed permanent. Consulting engineers recommended a bridge crossing, 9 kilometers long and curved on plan to avoid the very deep water at the narrowest part of the bay and the flight path from Rio's unusual city center airport. A 300-meter span with a shipping clearance of 60 meters was required over the main shipping lanes. Air traffic restricted total height to 72 meters. The consultants therefore designed the central navigation spans as a continuous steel box girder, the center span of 300 meters being the longest in the world. The British joint venture chose an erection scheme based on prefabricating 7 very large units, floating them out to the piers and jacking them into position in 5 lifts. As the approaches were prepared, an assembly yard was being built on Caju, a small island in a corner of the bay, for the British joint venture of Redpath, Dorman Long and the Cleveland Bridge and Engineering Company, who were awarded the contract for the navigation spans. To carry out the work in Brazil, they were associated with the Brazilian firm of Montreal Engenharia. 6 35-ton derrick cranes were brought from the United Kingdom and erected on the island. To accommodate the largest bridge sections, the island had to be extended at one end. At the other end, a deep water berth was built to receive the prefabricated components shipped from England. At Darlington, Middlesbrough and Scunthorpe, new grade 55 steel in thicknesses up to 60 millimeters was stockpiled for the job of fabricating the 15-meter panels. encountered in welding this new steel in such large sections, and new welding procedures had to be devised using extensive preheating. Largest components were these 43-ton pier units. When ready, the sections were taken to Teesside to be loaded aboard the motor vessel Carolina, chartered for 8 return voyages direct to Kaju Island. Carolina discharged her first cargo at the new berth on Kaju Island. Contrary to popular belief, Rio does not enjoy perpetual sunshine, as the British ambassador discovered on an early site visit with Leopold Rothschild. Rothschild arranged much of the finance for the project. As assembly and welding progressed on Kaju, the route across the bay was marked by tubular steel pile casings, foundations for more than 100 bridge piers. On the island, the center span, 176 meters long and weighing 3,500 tons, was taking shape. The vast structure, built on an assembly stillage, was lifted off by 2 steel swan neck frameworks, which incorporated the purpose-designed jacking equipment. Lifting was carefully monitored and deflections checked against computer calculations. The swan neck supported the span as it was slowly jacked more than 50 meters along the twin jetties, sliding on belts of special material to overcome friction. The movement was relatively slow, but moving 3,500 tons is a somewhat large undertaking. As soon as the center span was moved from its assembly stillage, work on the first side span pair was pushed ahead in the space made available. The center span became known as the pontoon unit. Before final incorporation in the bridge structure, it was to act as a pontoon on which the side span units were floated out for 3 kilometers to the main channel piers. The 450-ton capacity jacks passed their first test. Later, they were to be used 12 at a time to lift the side spans to the top of the bridge piers. Having reached the ends of the jetties, the pontoon unit was secured in its temporary storage position. As the side span assembly progressed, the Carolina made another visit, this time bringing the 43-ton pier units fabricated in Middlesbrough. Out in the bay, despite difficulties caused by geological conditions, progress was now rapidly being made on the 103 marine piers. Over 3,000 precast concrete boxes, each weighing up to 110 tons, were used in building the 80-metre approach spans. Of interest to the British engineers was the fact that the 4 piers to support the navigation spans were now almost complete. On completion of the first pair of side span units, they too were jacked up and slid along the jetties, close behind the pontoon unit, to provide space for construction of the second pair. At that stage, the pontoon unit was at the ends of the jetties, the first side span pair behind it, with the second pair being built on the stillage. The time had now arrived to lower the pontoon unit into the water and float it clear, enabling the first side span pair to be moved to the ends of the jetties. For some months to come, the pontoon unit would remain in the water, while being fitted out with its temporary trestling and pumping system. Possession of the main piers was obtained, the joint venture began setting up the ring girders and jacking columns on the pier bases. These lifted themselves as the columns were placed. The pontoon unit was now ballasted to move under the first side span unit. As water was pumped out, it rose and picked up its load. In the process, the side span units changed shape from sagging to hogging, the deflections being as predicted in calculation. As the ballast tanks were trimmed, this awesome vessel was ready to be towed out into the bay. Before moving to the piers, it was temporarily moored to the naval buoy normally used by Brazil's aircraft carrier, to which it bore a marked resemblance. Things looked peaceful enough in the morning light as preparations were made on the ring girders to receive the side span unit, but this was not to be easily achieved. The jacking columns now in position up the piers seemed to be very delicate compared with the weight they were to lift. In all, raising the side span pair and equipment meant lifting some 5,300 tons through a height of 52 meters. Moving this cumbersome vessel across one of the world's busiest shipping lanes meant close coordination between engineers and harbour authorities. A radio command post aboard the pontoon unit controlled the various tugs. One attempt to transfer the side span unit to the ring girders had to be abandoned when a sudden swell arose following a storm in the Atlantic. This would have turned the 300-meter-long unit into a gigantic battering ram. Most major operations had to be carried out at night to obtain optimum tide, calm water, and low wind conditions. The side span unit was positioned above the ring girders, and by ballasting, the pontoon unit was gradually lowered onto its seating. By next morning, the pontoon unit was pulled clear and ballast water pumped out. After that, it was towed back to Kaju Island, ready to move the next side span unit. Side span units on the ring girders, the balancing jacks had to be watched on a 24-hour rotor to make necessary compensations for distortions caused by temperature changes. When the jacking operation began, it was controlled from a central panel, where every movement was accurately monitored. The jacks were supported on the columns by a series of steel shear plates, set at 1.5-meter intervals with yokes at the top and bottom of the jacks. The yokes alternatively took the weight and so walked up the columns. This successful system enabled each pair of side span units to be raised to the pier tops in 4 days. The two halves were then jacked across, lowered onto their bearings and welded together. While these major lifts were going on, the smaller spans, if 44 meters can be called small, were being completed on the island. As with the main spans, the Brazilian welders proved to be first-class craftsmen. These units were brought direct to the piers and raised by cables controlled by winches on the bridge deck. The last journey of the center span was to place it in position for the final lift. Temporary trestles and pumps had been removed, and jacking equipment had been installed at each end, ready to engage the jacking columns, which, dismantled from the piers, were hung vertically from the ends of the side spans. control in this instance was located on the center span. With ships passing beneath the bridge and aircraft flying over it, the center span rose slowly from the sea. Once clear of the water, the cables securing it to anchors on the seabed were cut. The unit was then steadied by a damping system of suspended cables. Jacking to its final position required round-the-clock working and monitoring, the position of the girders being continually adjusted to compensate for thermal changes. By the end of December 1973, lifting operations were complete, and the bridge was a structural entity. It stretched across Guanabara Bay from Niteroi to Rio, 9 kilometers of concrete and steel. To meet an opening date in March 1974, finishing processes followed in rapid succession. The steel surface of the navigation spans had to be sandblasted and primed prior to surfacing. With temperatures on the deck reaching 70 degrees centigrade, 160 Fahrenheit, this was not an enviable task. Often a sudden tropical rainstorm would rust the sandblasted steel before the primer could be applied, and it all had to be done again. The bridge was cleaned and paved with epoxy resin asphalt. The men sticking their necks out are installing strip lighting to illuminate by night the graceful curve of the bridge. The project had been inaugurated when Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II laid the foundation stone during her state visit to Brazil. Now it was complete. It was opened on the 4th day of March 1974 by President Garastazu Medici, accompanied by Minister of Transport Mario Andreazza. The car chosen for the presidential crossing was a fitting tribute to the British financial and engineering contribution to this Rolls-Royce of bridges. At 6 o'clock next morning, the toll gates were opened, and within 24 hours, 37,000 vehicles had crossed over. Ponte Presidente Costa Silva, it is the longest bridge in the southern hemisphere. Over 13 kilometers from end to end, 9 of them over water. 40,000 tons of British steel were used in the foundations, as well as the 13,000 tons in the navigation spans. The joint venture are proud to have played a major part on this project together with their Brazilian colleagues. And they leave behind not only one of the world's great bridges, but a lasting monument to Anglo-Brazilian cooperation and friendship.